Let's have a look at the biblical account of the rape of Dinah. With a little help from Legoland, of course, Genesis 34, Dinah, the daughter of Jacob through Leah, went out to meet the young women of the area. Shechem, his real name is Shechem, which for some reason Westerners have a hard time pronouncing, the son of Hamor the Hivite, the prince of the land, saw her. That's the background. Now, let's have a look at what Jonathan Kirsch has to say. Only a single sentence is offered to explain Dinah's role in the tragic affair. She went out to see the daughters of the land. Yet even this sparse bit of intelligence is tantalizing. To the stern rabbinical sages who interpreted and embroidered upon the story of Dinah, the sight of a single woman at liberty in the countryside was distressing and dangerous. Indeed, they could not rid themselves of the notion that a woman is a seducer by nature, or at best, a victim of her own vanity and curiosity. Thus, one ancient biblical sage suggested that Dinah ventured out of her father's tent adorned like a harlot. That's what a lot of traditionalist interpreters have done. But of course, we want to open other possibilities. That means more and more engaging issues that you better believe scholars debate. Kirsch goes on, had she remained at home, nothing would have happened to her, goes the rabbi's homily. But she was a woman, and all women like to show themselves in the street. Ooh, what a broad brush view of women. All women like to show themselves in the street? Oh, come on, Rabbi. Kirsch continues, a feminist Bible critic named Ita Sheres has described Dinah's excursion as an outing, a word that once meant only a day in the country, but now suggests that Dinah engages in something even more daring, a bold act that implied individuality and purpose. Welcome to feminist biblical criticism. Whatever you think of feminist critics, feminist criticism, you have to examine the arguments that are made and ask, is there something to this? Don't have to agree, but we have to know what's being debated out there, what academics are talking about. So daring and dangerous is Dinah's adventure in the eyes of the biblical author that she is made to nearly disappear from her own story. But we can still detect faint echoes of Dinah's voice in the text of Genesis 34. Very nicely written. We can still detect faint echoes of Dinah's voice. What happens to the voice of women in the biblical narrative? If we're discussing the Bible as literature, we have to notice what we call voice. Who's driving the action? Also, who's doing the speaking? And yes, in a largely patriarchal society, it's usually men. But what happens to that submerged woman's voice? Can we perhaps find it? He seized her, it says, forced himself on her, and raped her. He became deeply attached to Dinah. He loved the young woman and tried to console her. Here we have to have a look at the Hebrew itself. Again, you don't have to know Hebrew, but you need someone to take you by the hand and share what the original text is saying. V'yar ota Shechem, and Shechem saw her, ben Hamor, the son of Hamor, Hachivi, the Hivite, Nasi haaretz, the prince of the land, v'yikach ota, and he took her, v'yishkav ota, and he laid with her, v'ya'neha. It's translated as raped, but is that really the best translation, the best understanding of this Hebrew text? It's going to focus on these last three words. V'yishkav ota v'ya'aneha. And he lay with her and raped her. Oh, really? Kirsch continues, none of the Hebrew words and phrases used by the biblical author to describe what Shechem did to Dinah are translated straightforwardly as rape. The Bible tells us that he saw her, and he took her, and lay with her, according to the conventional English translation. And then the biblical author adds one more interesting phrase, and humbled her. Humbled her. So we ask, does Shechem actually rape Dinah? That word ya'aneha, is that really rape? Is it humbling? Or is something more subtle going on between the love-struck young prince and the adventurous daughter of Jacob? Kirsch is setting up an argument, and everything, of course, is an argument when it comes to literary criticism. We can't stress strongly enough, you don't have to agree. We're not telling you Kirsch is right. But we have to be aware of what serious biblical critics are arguing about. Different possibilities of reading and understanding the text. The Hebrew word inah, Kirsch goes on, translated in some English language Bibles as humbled, is rendered in other translations as abused or defiled or dishonored, indicating a degrading and debasing experience. Feminist Bible scholar Ita Sheres insists on translating the Hebrew text even more forcefully. Shechem tortured her. And that root word, inah, in Hebrew, does in fact imply tortured. The same critic, Kirsch continues, insists that the Hebrew phrase customarily translated as he lay with her, v'yishkav ota, really ought to be rendered in blunt street slang. He laid her. And as I look at those Hebrew words, v'yishkav ota, it sure looks to me like that's a better understanding. He laid her. The very next sentence of the biblical text assumes, or assures us, that Shechem falls promptly, powerfully, and poignantly in love with his victim. And we just read that. He became deeply attached to Dinah. Actually, and his soul did cleave unto Dinah, and he loved the damsel and spoke comfortingly unto the damsel. So the Bible itself allows the possibility that something other than forcible rape may have taken place. The word defiled is used elsewhere in the Bible to describe forbidden sexual relations rather than forcible ones. Forbidden sexual relations. Maybe something is happening here that's not rape, that's simply forbidden as far as the Israelite community is concerned. The biblical writer pauses to point out that Shechem cleaves to Dinah, the only other passage in the Hebrew Bible where the word is used in the same sense to describe a loving relationship between two human beings is the story of creation in the book of Genesis, which we looked at earlier and pointed out that very word, cleave, which we explained can be understood as a type of cementing or gluing, in fact. Therefore shall a man cleave, or leave his father and mother, and cleave unto his wife. V'davak ba'ishto, says the original Hebrew text. Cleave, be glued to his wife, and they shall be one flesh. Some scholars have detected traces of both rape and seduction in the biblical text. One Bible scholar has decoded the text of Genesis 34 in a way that suggests the Yahwist. Of course, we have to dig into the theory of the documentary hypothesis of the Torah, that the Torah, the 5 books of Moses, were actually written by 4 different sources: the Yahwist, the Elohist, the priestly source, and the Deuteronomist. That, of course, is also a theory, and you don't have to accept it. But there is an argument by one Bible scholar that the Yahwist source was describing a rape, and the Elohist was describing a seduction. And the so-called redactor, or later editor, who wove these two separate traditions together into one, attached the two accounts into the ambiguous narrative that appears in the Bible. That's another way of looking at it. All arguments, all valid issues to debate. The text goes on. Shechem spoke to his father, saying, "Get me this young woman as a wife." And doesn't Legoland do a wonderful job here? As Kirsch continues, after the encounter between Shechem and Dinah, we are told nothing more about Dinah or her whereabouts until the very end of the biblical text. Dinah had apparently been sojourning in Shechem's house since the day of their first encounter. Is she a prisoner and a hostage of Shechem? Or is she a willing and perhaps even a loving guest of the young man who is so smitten with her? Kirsch goes on, if we recall Shechem's fervent protestations of love and his urgent desire to marry Dinah, we may be tempted to speculate that the two of them have fallen so deeply in love with each other that they dare to engage in some kind of forbidden sexual encounter. The anonymous editor of Genesis 34, Kirsch apparently accepts the idea that there was a later editor, redactor, who wove certain traditions together. Whether you agree or not, that's an argument. This anonymous editor may have sought to sully the reputation of Shechem and to provide an excuse for the massacre of his people by Simeon and Levi, by accusing him of a crime of sexual violence. Sure enough, there's going to be a massacre of the people of that city by Simeon and Levi. Maybe this is told in the way that it is as a kind of literary justification for the massacre. Perhaps what really happened between Shechem and Dinah was more nearly a forbidden romantic liaison than a rape or even a seduction. We've got to read this and study this carefully and then wrap our own brains around it and try to figure out the extent to which we agree with it, with this criticism, with this literary analysis, or not. Is there an undertext, a subtext to this whole passage? Yes or no? And nobody gets to sit on the fence, except your professor. The account goes on. Jacob heard that Shechem had defiled his daughter Dinah. But his sons were in the field with livestock, and Jacob kept silent until they returned. Beautifully illustrated, isn't it? Gotta love Legos. Hamor, the father of Shechem, went to Jacob to talk with him. When they heard of this, Jacob's sons came in from the field. They were very angry because Shechem had done a disgrace against Israel in lying with Jacob's daughter, something which ought not to be done. Hamor talked with them, saying, "The soul of my son Shechem longs for your daughter. Please give her to him as a wife. Intermarry with us, give your daughters to us, and take our daughters for yourselves. You shall dwell with us, and the land will be open to you," he says. "Live and trade in it, and acquire possessions of it." Now let's look again at Kirsch. Even if Shechem is a rapist, his proposal of marriage is less bizarre than it may first seem if we consider the curious punishment for the crime of rape under biblical law. The book of Deuteronomy tells us that any man who comes upon an unbetrothed virgin and lays hold on her and lies with her must pay her father 50 shekels and marry the woman he wronged. Deuteronomy 22. That's biblical law. If you lay with an unbetrothed virgin, you have to pay the bride price and marry her. The rapist is never permitted to divorce his victim-turned-wife. Divorce never allowed. That's his punishment. The legal codes of nearby Assyria, and we have a lot of them from ancient archaeological cuneiform texts, so it's very important to compare other ancient law codes with biblical codes. They suggest that a man might actually claim a wife by forcing himself upon her. A practice that offends our contemporary sensibilities, but suggests that Shechem's motive may have been rather more honorable than the biblical text allows us to understand. Amazing. Archaeology comes into play, and this is a Johnny-come-lately science, to look at these ancient Assyrian tablets from archaeological sites, compare them with the Bible, and come up with fresh insight. Is the Bible actually reflecting a culture where this law was in place? A man could claim a wife by forcing himself on her? It's not in biblical law, but it's in Assyrian law code. A woman in biblical times, says Kirsch, was expected to remain under the authority of a male at all times. As a child and a virginal young man, she lived in her father's home until she married. Once married, she lived with her husband, and she fervently hoped bore and raised his children. And if widowed, she relied on her own male children, who inherited their father's property. No other role was permitted, and a woman like Dinah, not yet married, but no longer a virgin, was not entitled to marry, bear or rear children, earn a living, or safely engage in sexual conduct. The Bible does not tell us what happened to Dinah after the night of carnage in Shechem's house. Dinah is still in Jacob's household when, many years later, the whole clan follows Jacob down to Egypt. A likely surmise is that Dinah was shut away in the house of her father, or perhaps one of her brothers. A spinster aunt with a dark past and no prospects, until she lived out her life in despair. Ooh. Sad, isn't it? Tragic. As we continue in the text, Shechem said to her father and to her brothers, "Let me find favor in your eyes. Whatever you require of me, I will give. Set the bride price as high as you please, and I will give whatever you ask. Just give me the girl as my wife." The sons of Jacob answered Shechem and Hamor, his father, "We cannot do this. To give our sister to someone who is uncircumcised would be a disgrace to us." Of course, we have to remember the situation of the Israelites in ancient Canaan. Here's a small tribe, and survival dictates that they don't intermarry outside of their own clan, their larger system of 12 tribes, or they're going to disappear as a people. And consequently, we find this strong injunction against any involvement with goyim, with outsiders, with non-Israelites, with the uncircumcised. And the text seems to be all over that, preaching it. Don't get involved with non-Israelites, with the uncircumcised people. This is a matter of our own survival. And this theme, as we noticed already, is pretty prominent in Fiddler on the Roof, all through Jewish history down to the present. Is it permissible, and of course it's not, to marry a non-Israelite. Only on one condition will we consent: if you will become like us, and every one of your males is circumcised. Only then will we give our daughters to you, and we will take your daughters to us, and we will deal with you and become one nation. Basically demanding that you become Israelites as well. And sure enough, all through history down to the present, if someone who's not Jewish wants to marry someone who is, then the non-Jew must convert to Judaism. And that means males must be circumcised, become Jewish in order to have a legal wedding. But if you will not listen to us and become circumcised, then we will take our sister and we will go. Their words pleased Hamor and his son Shechem. The young man did not hesitate to do this, because he took delight in Jacob's daughter, and he was the most honored in his father's house. Kirsch sums it all up. Much later in the Bible, we encounter David, the future king of Israel, as a young war hero who seeks to marry one of the daughters of the reigning king, Saul. Like Jacob, David is tricked into paying an odd bride price, a bizarre payment in kind that was designed by the jealous king to cost David his life. Saul is already envious and distrustful of David when the young warrior asks him for one of his daughters in marriage. Saul has slain his thousands, and David his tens of thousands, the Israelite women sing in praise of David when he returns from a glorious campaign against the Philistines. Saul's son, Jonathan, declares his love for David. The soul of Jonathan was knit with the soul of David. And so Saul's daughter, Michal, to eliminate the up-and-coming, much-beloved David, the crafty old king comes up with a scheme quite as dastardly as the one that Dinah's brothers work on Shechem. Saul promises Michal's hand in marriage to David, but only if he is able to pay an exceedingly bizarre bride price. The mohar demanded by King Saul is 100 foreskins of the Philistines. Sensibly enough, Saul is counting on the Philistines to resist circumcision, for Saul thought to make David fall by the hand of the Philistines. But Saul did not allow for the young warrior's skill and courage, his sheer determination to marry the king's daughter, and his flair for the flashy gesture in battle. David, ever the overachiever, brings back 200 foreskins, each one forcibly separated from its former owner, and claims Michal and as his wife. So these stories seem to find reflections elsewhere in the Bible and similar themes as we look at the text now as literary critics. Hamor and his son Shechem came to the city gate and spoke with the citizens of their city, saying, "These men are peaceful. Let them live in the land and trade in it. For the land is large enough for them. We will take their daughters as wives and give our daughters to them. Only on this condition will the men consent to live with us and become one nation, if every male among us becomes circumcised like they are. Let us give our consent to them, so they will dwell with us." And all the citizens agreed with Hamor and his son Shechem, and every male was circumcised. 3 days later, while the men were still in pain, 2 of Jacob's sons, Simeon and Levi, each took his sword and came into the unsuspecting city. They slaughtered all the males. That's the massacre that Kirsch mentions, that perhaps this story is trying to cover for or provide a justification for. They killed Hamor. and his son Shem. Kirsch writes, although Genesis 34 purports to describe events of the far distant past, long before the Israelites were enslaved by Pharaoh, long before they left Egypt under the leadership of Moses, the story of Dinah and Shem may have found its way into the Holy Scriptures in its current form as late as 400 BCE, when the oldest strands of Israelite legend, law, and lore were gathered and woven together into the work that we now know as the 5 books of Moses. At that moment in the history of Israel, the priests and scribes who assembled and edited the Bible were in despair over the unhappy fate of the Israelites. When the princes and priests of ancient Israel returned to Canaan, they found a land, a culture, and a community in deep crisis. The Israelites were tempted to consort with the strangers among them, to marry them and to worship their deities, and sometimes by availing themselves of sexual services of the temple prostitutes or participating in bacchanalian rituals, perhaps even offering human sacrifice. That's the background, and that again underscores the injunction that we have here. And again, Kirsch points out, to the contemporary reader, the use of sacred ritual to render men helpless so they can be more easily slaughtered is not only a dirty trick, but a sacrilege. At best, the mass circumcision demanded by Dinah's brothers suggests a kind of rough justice. Shem and all the menfolk of his tribe are sacrificed in the very organ that Shem used to defile her in the first place. But the biblical author who retold the tale of Dinah and her brothers was not merely setting up a sadistic joke at the expense of Shem. Rather, he was reminding his readership of what was regarded by the established religious leadership as an urgent threat to the very survival of the Israelites: the lure of strange gods and strange bedfellows. And they took Dinah out of Shechem's house and went away. Jacob's other sons came upon the slain. They plundered the city, taking their flocks, their herds, their donkeys, all that was in the city and in the fields, and all their wealth. They all took their wives and children captive and took as plunder everything in their houses. Jacob said to Simeon and Levi, "You have ruined me, making me odious to the inhabitants of the land, the Canaanites and the Perizzites. We are few in number. They will band together against us and attack. I will be destroyed, I and my household." Kirsch again weighs in. The Bible can be read as, among other things, a manual of survival for a nation of outsiders. As if prompted by the agonies of the Holocaust, the biblical court of conscience has begun to reconsider the antagonism between Jacob and his sons. A pronounced revisionist strain in post-war biblical scholarship suggests that Simeon and Levi, rather than Jacob, are the real heroes of Genesis 34. Think about that one. Precisely because they picked up their swords and made war on Shechem to vindicate their sister's defilement. Yet another way of looking at this. And, of course, raising more issues to debate as budding scholars. 2 extra-canonical books, that is, Bible-era religious writings that were excluded from the Hebrew Bible itself, offer a counter-tradition that undercuts the official version of the massacre of Shechem as reported in Genesis. The Testament of Levi, this is one of the books that just never made it into the Bible, but we have it as a text, shows us an angel descending from heaven to hand Levi a sword and a shield. God was on the side of the warriors, the counter-tradition holds, rather than the peacemaker. Bible critic Meyer Sternberg argues Simeon and Levi, they're the real heroes. Their concern has been selfless and single-minded to redress the wrong done to their sister. Their idealistic and uncompromising stance makes them the most intricate, colorful, and attractive characters in the story. Against the background of the Holocaust, the sword-bearing sons of Jacob seem far more compelling to us than their pragmatic and pacifistic father. And they journeyed, we are told in Genesis, and the terror of God was upon the cities that were round about them, and they did not pursue after the sons of Jacob. Something closer to Simeon and Levi can be seen in the pioneers of modern political Zionism in the late 19th century, who organized self-defense units in the towns and villages of Russia. Huge budding issue. What's the best way? To be pacifistic and nice to everybody, or to survive as Israelites, as Jews, in the face of those who seek our destruction? Simeon and Levi replied, "Should we have allowed him to treat our sister like a whore?" And one more bit from Kirsch. A close reading of Genesis 34 allows us to see that the Bible offers two visions of the stranger and two approaches to dealing with him. This is hugely important. One that exhorts us to make war, the other that encourages us to make peace, and even, as the story of Dinah and Shechem may secretly suggest, make love. Two different approaches. The Bible suggests that Jacob's way and the warrior's way are appropriate, each in its own time. To everything there is a season, we read in the celebrated passage of Ecclesiastes. A time to love, a time to hate, a time for war, a time for peace. Tragically, the Bible never tells us with clarity or certainty how and when to choose between them. The enigmatic fragment of Genesis in which Dinah's story appears, like so much of the Bible, can be used to validate either one. And of course, that's up to us to argue.